Hey everyone, this is a review lecture on neurotransmission, neurons, and neurotransmitters. This will certainly not replace in-class lectures. It'll go pretty quick and it'll be just an overview of these main ideas. I would highly recommend that you look at your notes from our class lectures to fill in some gaps. But this is just to refresh your memory on some of these big ideas and these big terms. First of all, neurocommunication, or what we call neurotransmission, what you have in front of you is just a basic neuron. And I have the different parts labeled for you, as you can see, and just some reminders for you that are worth thinking about. Remember that neurons are unique cells that send and receive messages. We have billions and billions of neurons in our body. Most of the neurons are going to be found in our brain. And messages are sent away from the cell body, or what we sometimes call a soma. And they are sent away from the cell body, traveling down the axon. You can see that here. The long arm of the neuron we call an axon. And you can remember that. Think the A in arm, the A in axon. And it travels away from the cell body. And our axons are protected by what's known as the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is this fatty substance that really serves two purposes. One, it protects the axon, and two, it speeds up the message itself. And as the message travels down the axon, it gets toward the end here, and we call these axon terminals. Sometimes you'll see it written as a terminal button. Sometimes it's just called a terminal. And this message is an electric message. And how that message goes down the axon, we'll talk a little bit more here on our next slide. But when the message gets to the end of the axon terminals, the electric message transitions into a chemical message, what we call neurotransmitters. It crosses this gap that is in between our two neurons. That gap, as a reminder, is called a synapse. And then it binds with a neighboring neuron at the dendrites. And you can see with this singular neuron here, we have the dendrites kind of on the back side. And so one more time, message travels from the soma, down the axon, to the terminals, across the synapse, and then to the neighboring cells' dendrites. Zooming in at the axon itself, we have this little segment here. If you zoom in, you can see how this message is sent down an axon. When neurons are at rest, they are polarized. And what I mean by polarized, we have these sodium ions that are along the outside of an axon wall, and we have potassium ions that are found on the inside. And remember our mnemonic of a salty banana with sodium on the outside and potassium on the inside. And what happens is when a neuron gets excited, when it's stimulated, then the sodium ions are going to rush inside of the axon. And when it rushes inside of the axon, that's the process of depolarization, where you have these ions that are separated at first, they're polarized, they become depolarized with an action potential. This happens when excitatory signals from neurotransmitters exceed the inhibitory signals, and they reach what's called a threshold. And remember that neurons fire on an all or none response. So I've given a couple of analogies for this. I've talked about a bucket on the edge of a table, and at some point that bucket falls over, or it doesn't fall over. It doesn't kind of teeter back and forth and halfway fall over. I've talked about firing a gun, right? And if you pull the trigger of a gun, it's either going to fire or it isn't, but it's not going to halfway fire. And that's how neurons work as well. They either fire or send a message down the axon, or they don't. With our chart on the right here, you can kind of see the three stages of an axon segment. When a neuron is at rest, it's just waiting for action. And I'll often give the analogy of like a neuron on your shoulder is just kind of at rest. It's waiting for some kind of message. Maybe that message is touch. Once that neuron is excited and it's sending a message, that's what we call an action potential. So first we have the resting potential, then we have an action potential when it becomes depolarized, and then it has to reset. And that's what we call a refractory period. It's kind of like when you flush the toilet and you have to wait for the toilet bowl to fill back up before you flush it again. That's the refractory period, or the resetting time. Zooming in even more to the very end of those terminals, we have on our screen here is synapse. And remember, the synapse is just the gap that exists between two neurons. So you have a sending neuron, what we call a presynaptic neuron, and then you have a receiving neuron, what we call a postsynaptic neuron. And that gap in between is where we find these neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters will cross the synapse and they'll bind at the receptor sites, kind of like a lock and key. And so it's a unique combination. And when those neurotransmitters cross over, they bind with the postsynaptic neuron. That's going to then excite the next neuron in this long chain of neurons that are sending a message. As a reminder, any neurotransmitter that's floating around in the synapse that isn't used is going to get recycled back up into that presynaptic neuron through a process called reuptake. And sometimes there's chemicals that are in our synapse that are trying to kind of mimic existing neurotransmitters. They're trying to either replicate or block, and these come in the forms of different psychoactive drugs. Some of these are perfectly legal substances, like Tylenol, for example. If you take a drug and that drug binds at a receptor site, and the receptor site believes that that is an actual neurotransmitter, those are what we call agonists. Right? So that's like when someone has a skeleton key and they put it in a lock and they're able to open the lock. It's an agonist. It's working just like that neurotransmitter would. So morphine, for example, is an agonist for endorphins. When morphine goes into your synapse, it's pretending to be an endorphin, and it works in very similar ways. Antagonists, on the other hand, are going to be chemicals that bind at a receptor site, but they don't work. And as a result, they prevent other neurotransmitters from binding at that site. So I give the example of if you put a key in a lock, but it doesn't turn the lock. It fits in there, but it doesn't turn. That's like an antagonist. A lot of antipsychotic medications, for example, are antagonists for dopamine. So they bind at a dopamine receptor. They don't work, so the dopamine doesn't get through. And dopamine neurotransmitters can't bind because there's that antagonist in the way. And then finally, just a quick slide about neurotransmitters. We have lots and lots of different neurotransmitters in our brain. This is just half a dozen of the really popular ones for AP psychology that we tend to see over and over again. And you can read through kind of the function of these neurotransmitters and some other interesting things that happen. Just some mnemonics to help you remember. Acetylcholine. Two big things with acetylcholine. They help with muscle movement and they help with memory. And so I give reminders like think an ACE bandage if you have a sore muscle. If you've been moving your muscles a bunch, you might need to have an ACE bandage. Or maybe you'll get a muscle ache. And that's not how you spell ache, but it kind of looks like ache. We sometimes abbreviate acetylcholine ACH, so you have a muscle ache. If you study really hard for a test, you could ace a test, right? If you've got a really good memory. So acetylcholine, think you're going to ace the test because of your memory. Dopamine, it's the pleasure center. When we do things that help us survive, so when we eat when we're hungry and we drink when we're thirsty, our brain helps release dopamine. It makes us feel good. And so it's highly involved with things like learning. We will learn to do things if we release dopamine after we do some particular action. And dopamine is highly involved with drugs. Lots of drugs release dopamine, which adds to the addictive properties of drugs. Serotonin, you want to tie that neurotransmitter with depression. In AP psychology, if you see a question about serotonin, I can almost guarantee the question will be about depression. Specifically, when serotonin levels dip, the chance of developing depression or depressive symptoms increases. Norepinephrine and epinephrine, you don't need to differentiate those terms themselves for the sake of this class. Know that both of them put you into fight or flight. Both of them get you ready for action. They'll do things like increase your heart rate, open your airways, dilate your pupils, all those things that prepare us for action. Think if someone has a peanut allergy and they eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and they start to choke, they may take an EpiPen, right? And what that EpiPen does, it has epinephrine, it opens up those airways. GABA, I always say, remember, get a brake adjustment. GABA is going to help slow our body down. GABA is going to lower that heart rate. GABA is going to kind of lower our breathing and things. And so the big thing that we see with GABA, know that it's what we call an inhibitor neurotransmitter. And then also, we tend to see questions about GABA when it's talking about anxiety. And you can think about how if a person is really anxious and they're moving a mile a minute, it could be that they don't have those brakes, right? They can't pump the brakes, they can't slow the body down. And so we see this association between not having enough GABA and experiencing anxiety. And then the last one on here, endorphins, those natural painkillers. When you stub your toe, your brain releases a bunch of endorphins that helps you cope with that pain. Now, real fast overview. I went really quickly, but hopefully this is just a reminder of some of the important things with neurons, the cell themselves, neurotransmission, when one neuron communicates with another, and neurotransmitters, those small chemicals that exist in the synapse. All right, that should do it, and good luck.